the type to play games, you can stake claims. Came to show the movement moving like a freight train, breaking walls and crumble earth with every step we take. We walking by with lash and your neck will break. Never let it stray, so say it wrong, we'll set it straight. So coming at us with an awkward demeanor is leaving your life in the dead of face. So pedal straight, avoid these shots, we send it all costs. Truly believing that it'll be different, we watching your body get hauled off. Simple as this, we giving the vibe of the revolution that we living within. Diminish the doubt of the haters that talk on the low because of this minuscule shit.
Just sit right back and you'll hear the tale of a topic that's gone on too long, but far be it from me to not kick a dead horse and generate some heat. So I was thinking about this all weekend with this never-ending Mythic Dungeon argument in terms to our beloved D20 fantasy. But then it got me thinking, okay, well, what exactly in the terms of the dungeon in Dungeons and Dragons, what is a dungeon? Now, we've done what is a dungeon before several times. You know, one of my very first videos was 10 years ago with what is a dungeon, where I postulated as an example of a dungeon the Death Star, because I figured everybody knows what the Death Star is pretty much, right? Or the Towering Inferno or the Titanic, you know. To define a dungeon as basically a limited amount of space that the player characters have access to, and the dungeon master has control to over all the ways the players have to get in and out. And there's only so much. And that states, you know, yeah, sure, the Death Star is a dungeon. The DM has complete control over the entrances, the exits, and what happens within. But the Death Star is only so big, so there's only so many things that you're going to run into. Right. But in the terms of our game of D&D and the quote-unquote Mythic Dungeon, where is that, you know, where's the real estate? Where does it start, you know? And of course, I'm going to continue to use my puerile argument that needs to die a slow, painful death, that this is imagination and make-believe, and as long as everybody at your table is having fun, who cares? So, okay, let's start with a simple one. Is a castle a dungeon in the terms of D&D? Well, it's got a map, it's got doors, it's got multiple levels, it's probably got a secret door or two, might have a trap, I'm not sure what that is. If it's probably going to have wandering encounters, i.e. guards, servants, maybe a ghost that wanders the hallways at night, cats, animals. There might be an encounter, especially if you're breaking into the castle at night to steal shit. So is a castle a dungeon? Or is it a castle? What about a tomb? And I found some tomb maps. You know, what is this? Is that a dungeon? I mean, it's a tomb. It's above ground, so it's a tomb. It's very limited space, right? Only like 3 or 4 at both rooms. It might have a trap if we're thinking like pyramids. It might have an encounter, like 1 or 2 undead. If it's a small tomb, it's a medium-sized tomb, you know. If we're talking like the necropolis under France, which is a huge tomb, I think, 115 million skulls or something like that. But is a tomb a dungeon or a pyramid? Is a pyramid a dungeon? Is the Great Pyramid of Giza a dungeon? It's got rooms, it got traps, it's got secret doors, it's supposedly haunted and has mystical powers, and there's definitely some wandering monsters in there. Okay, those wandering monsters are only rats, but and tourists, but still, is a tomb a dungeon? What about a city? And in my case, we'll go with my favorite city, Freeport, right? I mean, the city of Freeport has wandering monsters. It has encounters. It has a night and day cycle. It has monsters. It has horrors. There are adventures that take place within the city of Freeport. Is it a dungeon? Because it, meets all the criteria if we're defining the mythical dungeon as limited ways to get in, limited ways to get out, limited space, no matter how big it is. It's only that big. It's not like the wilderness, which is, infinite. A city has limits, and things can happen to you. And some things that happen in that city you can't explain, especially in Freeport. But I mean, if it's a D&D city, I'd say 90% of the D&D cities have weird shit going on, right? Waterdeep's got weird shit going on all the time. Stormwind from World of Warcraft, all the time. So is that a dungeon? All right. What about the one that started it all? Castle Greyhawk. Is Castle Greyhawk a dungeon? Because it's got stuff above ground. It's got a city around it. There's entire campaigns all built around what goes on the surface, but then it also has a whole bunch of underground stuff. Or is it a hybrid? Half dungeon with the underground stuff and half not dungeon. Half wilderness. But again, if we're defining dungeon with the following characteristics, then what is a dungeon? And there's no right answer to this because, it's more of a thought experiment. Where does the wilderness start and the dungeon stop? How is this dungeon different than, say, this tomb? Or this tomb? Or this dungeon? Or whatever this is. What about a mine? Are mines dungeon? Is the dungeon defined simply as underground or in a cave? I mean, is a goblin warren with 4 cave rooms a dungeon? What about a cave that has a bear in it? And that, is that a cave? Is a dungeon defined as more than one room or more than one cave or more than one space? Do we define the dungeon by the 5-room dungeon philosophy where within the dungeon, these 5 things happen in repeated circumstances? Is that what defines the dungeon? If we're saying there's going to be combat, there's going to be skill tests, there's going to be a chance to role play, and there's going to be rewards of some kind. And if that's what defines the dungeon, but then all the other previous ones have the potential to fill those slots, so they are then fall within the 5-room dungeon parameter. So does that make them a dungeon? Is it? I think we can all agree that it's more than one room. A dungeon has at least 2 or more rooms. If it's just one room, it's a cave or a shop. All right. Second, I think we can all agree that it's going to have tricks, it's going to have traps, it's going to have wandering monsters, and it's going to have something going on. So and there's a reason for you to be there. So that's the second thing. I think we can just say that no matter what, these are what defines the dungeon in terms of the mythic D&D dungeon. Now, the line of demarcation, the real estate question, of course, is when does the not dungeon stop and the dungeon start? Is it? I think most people subconsciously think if it's above ground, it's not a dungeon. And if it's below ground, it is. So like the castle could be 4 levels plus little side thingies, but that's all castle or ruins. The second you go underground, you're in the dungeon. And then at some point in time, the dungeon becomes the Underdark and the mythical dungeon. Of course, the dungeon could have things in it that make it mythical, but it could also just have completely normal things and nothing mythical about it. I mean, if it's a goblin-infested mine and the only encounters are goblins and things that goblins would have brought with them, and there's no hocus pocus, then it doesn't it might not qualify as a mythic dungeon. Or does it qualify as a mythic dungeon simply because of the fact that there are goblins down there, and it does have these weird things that only goblins would have with them, and some of these things are goblin and therefore don't make sense? Probably not. I think the third criteria is it has to have that aspect of weird, right? To be a dungeon, to not just simply be a space with encounters in it. You know, if I go rob a bank, is that a dungeon? It's got more than one room. It's got an encounter. It's got treasure. There might be a skill test. There might be a role-playing test. I might get hurt, but that's not a dungeon. That's robbing a bank. You know, if I go through the castle, that's the castle, because everything I encounter in the castle are things I would expect to find in the castle, even if it makes no sense, like a wizard summoning table. Or does that now make it a dungeon because it does have weird stuff in it? Is the definition of dungeon in reference to our hobby, D&D specifically, the second it becomes spooky, the second it becomes nonsensical, the second things are introduced that don't make sense. Definitely going to find certain things in a castle, right? Definitely going to find certain things in a cave. Definitely going to find certain things in a mine that just are universal constants. It's when you find those things that don't fit within the universal constant that I think the border between normal everyday space and dungeon begins, and the mythical aspect of the dungeon, the ridiculous aspect of the dungeon, as the make-believe aspect of the dungeon, when the dungeon becomes the dark forest. Once you start running into the things that don't make sense, and as you get deeper, because Gygax talks about, you know, a dungeon having bare minimum 12 levels and refers to Castle Greyhawk. Once you get deeper in the dungeon, the more obscure and bizarre and nonsensical things are going to become. The farther you get away from the surface, the farther you get away from home, the farther you get away from normal, is the deeper you get into the mythic underworld, the mythic forest. Because again, normal castle does not quantify as a dungeon because everything in it is normal. But Castle Ravenloft definitely does quantify as a dungeon. And the further you get into Castle Greyhawk, the more gothic and weird Ravenloft gets, leading up to, you know, your final encounter with Strahd, where you're completely in the realm of the unknown, where you're completely at the whims of Strahd, or going through something where, you know, you're dealing with Vecna or a Sarasek in Tomb of Horrors. It begins normal. The further you get away from the entrance, from the surface, the deeper you get into Ravenloft, the deeper you get into the encounters with Vecna, the deeper you get into the theoretical underworld, the more ridiculous the encounters get, and the less explanation I, as a GM, have to give. The wandering monster tables, which I think is the fourth thing that quantifies the dungeon, it's got to have wandering monsters of some form. The wandering monsters tend to get stranger. You know, at the start, you're going to run into things you expect to run into, humans and humanoids. I'm going to run into guards, and I might run into some goblins and goblinoids. That's okay. But the farther away you get from the surface, the weirder the encounters on the wandering monster are going to get too, where you're more scratching your head going, why is there a giant chicken that can turn me into stone down here? Why is there a giant jello mold down here? Where did that clockwork come from? But because we have entered the mythic, gotten further away from the surface, the less explanations you have to give. It's magic. You're gonna encounter things that don't make sense, and you're gonna encounter things that do make sense. And I don't have to explain them because it's make-believe. And we all agree that these are the parameters of the Mythic Dungeon. Again, I think we are unconsciously locked into the idea that it becomes a dungeon the second we go underground. But then there are a lot of dungeons that don't go underground. Two of the best, Pharaoh and Ravenloft, have nothing to do with underground, but they're both dungeons. They both have that mythical quality. They both deal with the unknown and the situations that don't make sense. And the further you get away from the entrance, the further away you get away from the surface, the further you get away from home, the weirder things get and the less the world has to explain to you. And this cycles all the way back to my original statement, which some people misconstrued, and my other original statement. And of course, my original statement is the dungeon in D&D, as Gygax originally created it, is just another version of the unknown forest, the dark forest, the mythical forest, the fairy tale forest. And the dark forest has been around for as long as there have been stories. You could go all the way back to the Greek plays. You could go even further back to ancient Mesopotamia and documentations of stories there and play and stuff like that, or even further to pictographs on walls. Our various earliest ancestors attempting to record their history ran into things they couldn't explain. And so those were quantified by the supernatural, by the unknown, by the idea that the farther I get away from home, the weirder stuff is going to get. And the weirder the stuff gets, the less likely the universe is going to explain it to me. And quite frankly, the universe doesn't have to explain it to me. You know, we talk about this in the heroic journey too. And even Bilbo talks about it in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, that once you step out your door and put your feet on the road, you don't know where the road's going to take you. And you don't know what you're going to encounter. But if you make it back home, you will be changed. You will encounter things you do not understand. And because you are in the mythic dungeon, you don't have to understand them. Now, from a gaming point of view, and to once again defend my it's make-believe, and it doesn't matter because it's make-believe, because some people still don't understand what I'm trying to say here. If we all, if the four people at my table, Cal, Shadow, Jen, and Mike, and RPG Grandma, all have agreed to the world we're playing in, and they're all having fun in my game. We've done 4 live plays now. They're all down below. You can all see that everybody has agreed to the make-believe of the game I'm running. If anybody didn't agree to it, they would let me know. We would address that and we would change it. But right now, it's make-believe. We've all agreed to the make-believe. That it doesn't matter to me what anybody else thinks about the game I'm running now. All it matters to me is the players at the table are enjoying it. We've all agreed on the make-believe. We're all enjoying it. And as long as you're all agreeing on the rules of make-believe, it's not wrong. That works with a bunch of old grognards. That works with 6-year-olds. That works on the playground. As long as everybody is playing house and agrees on the rules of playing house, doesn't matter how weird playing house on the playground gets with the 6-year-olds. As long as everybody's agreed and having fun, doesn't matter if what you're observing makes no sense to you. I don't care if you don't like the way I run my game or my D&D philosophy. Go ahead, make a dozen videos about how dumb they are. You're only doing me a favor, but yeah. So what constitutes the dungeon to close this? Because I was thinking about this all weekend, and I actually looked stuff up. I actually looked up the definition of the heroic journey, and I looked up the mystical forest concept, because I was like, wait, am I getting this wrong? Because at least one person seems to think I'm completely wrong. But no, I was correct. So yes, the castle, the tomb, the city, the pyramid, the jungle, the boat, the tower, the space station can all be dungeons if they meet those categories, you know, and one of those categories is the farther you get away from the surface, because it doesn't have to be underground, right? Pharaoh is a dungeon. It's not underground. It's just the farther you get away from, quote unquote, the surface, the entrance, the first room, the farther you get away from home, the deeper you get into the dungeon, the more mythical it gets, because the more unknown you're more likely to encounter, and the more likely the things you encounter don't have an explanation. They're there just cuz. How did that get there? Magic. How did that get there? Well, you see, several thousand years ago, the dwarves dug in and they built a thing, and there was a cistern, but then there was a collapse because they didn't put up the proper the proper supports. And then over the years, another thing came in and dug out that space. So now, you know, you could do that, or you could just simply say magic. It's the unknown. I don't have to give you an explanation. You shouldn't expect an explanation. The universe doesn't owe you an explanation. And the farther you get away from the surface, the less likely you're going to get an explanation. The deeper we get in the ocean, the weirder this shit gets. The farther away from Earth we get, the weirder the shit gets. The farther away you get from home, the deeper you are going into the unknown, the more likely you're going to encounter things that do not quantify with your limited understanding of the universe, which can only be explained by mythical. So what is the myth? What is the dungeon as opposed to the castle of Bob, the tomb of Steve, the city of Steve, or, you know, Steve's pyramid? There's nothing freaky, fantastical, wackadoodle going on in any of those. But the dungeon of Steve, well, there's plenty of weird wackadoodle stuff going on in there. And you know what? I don't have to explain all of it, as long as we've all agreed that this is the make-believe we want to play for this 3 hours. So there you go. Maybe I'll do this again and we'll talk about traps, because that's a favorite of mine. If you appreciate this nonsense, let me know. If you don't appreciate this nonsense, let me know. We need to separate unknown from unknowable. True. Yes. Thank you, Bob. There are unknown things that can become known, and then there's unknown things that can never be known. That will always be unknowable. That will always be just out of reach. When I enter that dark room for the first time, it's unknown until I light it up and walk the 4 corners. Then it's known. And once it's known, there's a 90% chance that room will always be the same. Every time I go back to that room, I expect it to be the same. Every time I go into my room, I expect my room to be the same. There's always that 10% chance that the cat has come in and knocked something over, so that when I go into my room, I like, what? And that's the unknowable. And the unknowable are also things that just science can't understand. We can't explain. Number stations. Number stations have been on the air longer than there have been radios. One of the very first signals Marconi picked up when he got the radio working for the very first time was a number station. Where are those numbers coming from? We don't know. We have guesses, but nobody's ever really explained number stations. They're just out there. Think about that. Think about that. I look forward to the multiple videos responding to this. Until next time, I'm the OG GM, just blathering. Just blathering. There's no right or wrong. This is just me shooting off random ideas occasionally to educate you. Because, you know, at the end of the day, this is supposed to be about fun. And if you're not having fun listening to what I have to say, at least let me know. You can always take your subscriptions elsewhere. And if you do appreciate what I have to say, then I appreciate you for appreciating it. And, you know, there is a Patreon and there is product you could purchase. But just the fact that you're here listening to me blab for half an hour is all I really need. Thanks, Bog McDowell, for dropping by. Till next time, see ya.